The wind howled through the skeletal oaks lining the path to Mayfield's chapel, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It was October 1838, and the town of Eldridge Hollow clung to the hills like a forgotten prayer, its wooden homes sagging under the weight of another harsh autumn. Reverend Elias Mayfield stood at the pulpit, his tall frame silhouetted against the flickering lantern light, his black coat hanging loose on shoulders once broad but now sharpened by fasting and fervor. His eyes, dark and unblinking, swept over the sparse congregation, 30 souls, give or take, huddled on the hard benches, their faces etched with the weariness of fever season. Beside him, in the front pew, sat Widow Harlan, her hands twisted in her lap like knotted roots. She was the cautious one, always had been, her gray hair pulled tight under a bonnet that hid the tremor in her neck. She'd lost her husband to the cholera 2 summers back, and now her boy, little Tom, coughed wetly in the crook of her arm. Across the aisle, young Samuel Greer slouched, his witty tongue silenced for once by the shadows under his eyes. Samuel was the miller's son, brave in a scrap but reckless with secrets, and he'd taken to staring at the Reverend with a mix of awe and unease. The fourth, old Doc Whitaker, nursed a flask hidden in his Bible, his mustache twitching as he muttered prayers that smelled of whiskey. These 4, Mayfield, Harlan, Samuel Greer, formed the uneasy heart of the flock that night, the others mere echoes in the gloom. Mayfield's voice rose, steady as the tolling bell outside. The Lord tests us, brethren, with plagues that devour the body and sins that corrupt the soul. But hear me, in the earth we were formed, and to the earth we shall return, not in scattered graves, but in unity, as one body under his will. His words hung heavy, the lantern flame dancing in his pupils like captive spirits. The congregation shifted, murmurs rippling like wine through dry leaves. Widow Harlan clutched Tom closer, her lips moving in silent rebuttal, while Samuel leaned forward, brow furrowed, as if deciphering a riddle in the Reverend's gaze. Outside, the storm broke, rain lashing the chapel's tin roof in relentless sheets. It drowned the distant cries from the outskirts, where the sick lay in their beds, untouched by the Reverend's visits. Mayfield had stopped going to the ill weeks ago, claiming visions, God's command to prepare, not to palliate. That morning, he'd gathered picks and shovels from the mill, his face alight with purpose, and now, as thunder cracked, he stepped down from the pulpit, his boots thudding on the worn floorboards. "Sister Harlan," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away, her eyes searching his for the man she'd known before the fever started. "The time draws near. The Lord has shown me the pit, a great vessel to hold us safe from the corruption above." Tom whimpered, and she shushed him, her voice a fragile thread. "Reverend, the doctor's tonics, they eased my husband's pain. Why turn from that now?" Doc Whitaker snorted from his pew, flask glinting as he raised it. "Because the good Reverend hears voices louder than mine, Eliza. And mine say this storm's just the start, flood's coming, mark my words." His caution masked fear, the kind that came from burying too many too soon. Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping like a warning. "A pit? You mean like the old quarry?" "Reverend, that's no sanctuary, it's a grave waiting to swallow us whole." His words carried the bite of youthful defiance, but Mayfield only smiled, thin and knowing, as if the boy had voiced a prophecy. The rain pounded harder, turning the paths to mud, and inside, the air grew thick with unspoken dread. Mayfield moved among them, distributing lanterns and lengths of rope, his touch lingering like a benediction, or a chain. "Faith is our light," he intoned. "Doubt is the true plague." As the congregation rose, reluctant shadows trailing him toward the door, the chapel seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with the weight of what was to come. Little Tom buried his face in his mother's skirt, and for a moment, the thunder sounded like the earth itself groaning in anticipation. The lantern's flame flickered against the rough-hewn walls of the church basement, casting long shadows that danced like accusing fingers. Reverend Elias Mayfield knelt before the narrow wooden table, his fingers tracing the faded ink of the leather-bound Bible. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and tallow, and outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the foundation, carrying whispers of the storm that had raged since dawn. It was the third night of unrelenting rain, turning the fields into a quagmire that swallowed wagon wheels and hope alike. Elias's breath came steady, though his knuckles whitened around the book's edges. He was a man of 42, broad-shouldered from years of tilling church land before the call to preach, with eyes like polished obsidian that missed little. Tonight, they burned with a fervor that bordered on fever. "Lord, guide my hand," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the stone. The words weren't prayer so much as command, born from visions that had plagued his sleep for weeks, visions of earth rising to claim the unworthy, of purification through the grave. Footsteps creaked on the stairs behind him, hesitant at first, then firmer. Widow Harlan descended, her shawl clutched tight against the chill, her face gaunt under the lantern's glow. She was the eldest of his flock, 60 if a day, with hands calloused from weaving and a tongue sharp as a scythe. "Reverend," she said, her voice cutting through the gloom, "the boy's worse. Fever's got him shaking like a leaf in that wind. Doc Simmons ain't come back from the river crossing, says the bridge is half gone." Elias rose slowly, closing the Bible with a snap that silenced the room. He turned to her, his expression unyielding, though a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed his features before vanishing. "The boy clings to this world, Martha. But the signs are clear. The floods, the sickness spreading from cabin to cabin, it's the Lord's reckoning." He stepped past her toward the stairs, his boots thudding against the packed dirt. She followed, her skirts whispering against the steps, but her eyes narrowed in the dim light. Up in the sanctuary, the pews stood empty save for a few huddled figures near the altar. The storm battered the windows, rain lashing like divine lashes. Young Tommy Harlan lay on a pallet there, his small chest heaving with ragged breaths, skin slick with sweat. Beside him sat Caleb Thorne, the blacksmith, his massive arms folded across his chest, face etched with lines deeper than the forge's bellows. Caleb was cautious by nature, a man who weighed every hammer strike, and tonight his silence spoke volumes. "Reverend," Caleb rumbled as Elias approached, "we can't just wait. The water's rising, creeks overflowed the graveyard already. If we don't move the sick to higher ground." He trailed off, glancing at Tommy, whose whimpers cut the air like knives. Elias knelt by the boy, placing a hand on his forehead. The heat seared through his palm, a brand of judgment. "Higher ground won't save us from what's coming," he said softly, his voice weaving certainty into the chaos. "The earth itself cries out for the pure. I've seen it, the barrows, the mounds where the faithful rest eternal." His words hung, painting pictures in the flickering candlelight, ancient tells swelling underfoot, promising shelter in the soil. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, but Caleb leaned forward, his whisper urgent. "That's madness, Elias. Burying the living. The boy's just sick, plague or ague, not some curse." Tension coiled in his shoulders, the kind that preceded a swing. Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "Doubt is the devil's tool, brother. Remember the flood of 32? We lost half the congregation to denial. This time, we heed the call." He stood, gesturing to the shadows beyond the altar, where shovels leaned against the wall like silent sentinels. The first plan had been simple: dig a communal shelter in the hill behind the church, a place to ride out the deluge. But as the digging began that afternoon, the earth had resisted, yielding only mud that slid back like a living thing, burying tools and resolve alike. Now, as thunder cracked overhead, Elias's voice rose. "We adapt. The grave becomes the ark." Tommy stirred, mumbling incoherently, and in that moment, the lantern sputtered, plunging the room into near darkness. The shadows deepened, and for a heartbeat, the air tasted of soil and finality. Martha crossed herself, her caution fracturing into quiet tears, while Caleb's fists clenched, the argument brewing unspoken. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof, as if the heavens themselves approved the descent. Reverend Elias Mayfield knelt before the small altar he'd improvised from crates and burlap, his knees pressing into the cold earth floor. The air down here was thick with the scent of damp stone and something sharper, fear, perhaps, or the faint rot from the barrels of salted meat stacked in the corner. Above, the wind howled through the cracks in the floorboards, carrying whispers of the storm that had trapped them all these 3 days. Elias's hands trembled as he traced the worn leather of his Bible, its pages yellowed and frayed from years of fervent clutching. He could hear them upstairs, the remnants of his flock, huddled in the nave, their murmurs rising like a tide. Widow Hargrove's voice cut through sharpest, laced with that unyielding doubt she'd harbored since her husband's fever took him last harvest. "It's the devil's work, Reverend, not the Lord's. We've sinned, but this hiding like rats." He closed his eyes, willing the words away. The visions had started innocently enough, a dream of earth swallowing the unworthy, a voice in the night promising salvation through the soil. But now, with the ground outside turning to mire and the fever creeping from farm to farm, those visions felt like chains. God had spoken, Elias was merely the vessel. Yet doubt gnawed at him, a serpent in his garden. Footsteps thudded down the stairs, heavy and deliberate. It was Amos, the blacksmith, his broad frame filling the doorway, soot-streaked face etched with lines deeper than the forge's bellows could carve. Amos had always been the steady one, his faith forged in the fire of loss, his son drowned in the river 2 summers back. But tonight, his eyes held a storm of their own. "Reverend," Amos rumbled, voice low to not carry upstairs. "They're restless. Little Timmy's cough is worsening, and Sarah's babbling about seeing shadows in the rafters. We can't stay cooped up forever. The storm will break soon enough." Elias rose slowly, smoothing his threadbare cassock. He met Amos's gaze, searching for alliance, but found only the quiet accusation of a man who'd hammered iron into tools of survival while the preacher hammered sermons into souls. "The storm is a sign, brother. The Lord tests us, buries us in trial to raise us renewed. We've prayed, we've fasted. Tomorrow, when the waters recede, we'll emerge stronger." Amos shifted, his massive hands flexing as if gripping an invisible hammer. "Signs and trials. That's what you said when the crops failed, when the fever came. But burying? That's what the visions told you last night, isn't it? I heard you shouting in your sleep." He stepped closer, the lantern light hollowing his cheeks. "What if it's not God, Elias? What if it's just you?" The word struck like a chisel, splintering the fragile dam Elias had built around his resolve. He turned away, toward the altar, where a single candle burned with unnatural steadiness. In its flame, he saw the earth again, dark, yielding, a grave for the faithful. No, not a grave. A womb. Rebirth. The voice had promised it, clear as scripture, "Bury them alive in the sanctified ground, and they shall rise eternal, free from plague and sin." But Amos's doubt echoed the whispers in Elias's own mind. He gripped the Bible tighter, knuckles whitening. "Faith isn't sight, Amos. It's obedience. If we falter now, the fever claims us all. I've seen it, the end times unfolding. The ground will take the pure and spare the wicked their torment." Amos didn't back down, his breath steady despite the basement's chill. "And who's to say who's pure? You. Us." He glanced toward the stairs, where a child's whimper pierced the gloom. "The boy's burning up. We need a doctor, not dreams." Elias whirled, his voice rising despite himself, a preacher's fire igniting. "Doctors peddle false hope. God provides the true physician, the earth itself. Tomorrow, we dig the pit in the churchyard. We lower them in, alive and praising, and seal it with prayer. It's His will." The words tasted of ash, but he forced them out, watching Amos's face harden. The blacksmith stood silent for a long moment, then nodded once, curt as a hammer's strike. "I'll help dig, if it comes to that. But mark me, Reverend, if this is madness, it'll bury you first." He turned and climbed the stairs, each step a retreating thunder. Elias sank back to his knees, the Bible falling open in his lap to a passage he knew by heart, the valley of dry bones, rising at God's command. But as the shadows lengthened, he couldn't shake the image of Amos's eyes, eyes that saw not a prophet, but a man unraveling. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing the earth like tears from heaven, and in the basement's depths, Elias wondered if the ground hungered for more than salvation. The lantern's flame flickered in the draught seeping through the church's warped floorboards, casting jagged shadows that danced like accusing fingers across the faces gathered below the pulpit. Reverend Elias Mayfield stood at the edge of the platform, his black coat hanging loose on his gaunt frame, eyes burning with a fervor that had only intensified since the fever took half the town. Below him, the remnants of his flock, old widow Hargrove, her hands twisted with rheumatism, young Thomas Hale, the miller's boy with dirt still caked under his nails, and Eliza, his own daughter, pale and silent in the back pew, waited, their breaths shallow in the chill air. "Brethren," Mayfield intoned, his voice a low rumble that filled the empty spaces where voices once rose in him, "the Lord has spoken through the signs. The ground trembles, the skies weep blood at dawn, and the wicked flee to the cities. But we are the chosen, sealed against the coming wrath." He paused, letting the words hang, his gaze sweeping over them like a scythe. Widow Hargrove nodded faintly, her lips moving in silent prayer, while Thomas shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door as if expecting the storm outside to burst through. Eliza watched her father from the shadows, her fingers tracing the worn edge of her Bible. She had seen the change in him these past weeks, the way his sermons twisted from comfort to condemnation, how he spoke of burial not as an end, but as a holy enclosure. Last night, in the parsonage, he had whispered to her of a vision, the earth opening to swallow the faithful, protecting them from the fires above. She wanted to speak, to ask why the dreams that once brought him peace now drove him to pace the floor until dawn, but the weight of his expectation silenced her. The Reverend descended the steps, his boots thudding softly on the wood. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, the boy's muscles tensing under the touch. "You've doubted, son. I see it in your eyes. But doubt is the devil's whisper. Tomorrow, we prepare the vessel, the great pit in the meadow, blessed by my hand. It will be our ark, lined with the word, safe from the tribulation." Thomas swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he replied, "Reverend, the others, they left when you spoke of it last Sunday. Said it sounded like madness. What if, silence?" Mayfield's grip tightened, not cruelly, but with the unyielding pressure of conviction. The lantern sputtered, plunging the boy's face into momentary darkness. "The Lord tests us through the weak. Eliza, my child, tell him. Tell him of the promise." She rose slowly, her skirts whispering against the pew, and met her father's eyes. "It's God's will, Thomas," she said, the words tasting like ash. But inside, a knot twisted tighter, memories of her mother's grave, dug too shallow in the last outbreak, and the Reverend's refusal to weep. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal oaks, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. Widow Hargrove murmured agreement, her voice frail but steady, as if clinging to the promise of salvation amid her aches. Mayfield released Thomas and turned to the altar, retrieving a small vial of oil from the cloth-draped table. He anointed each forehead in turn, the slick liquid cold against skin, murmuring incantations from Revelation. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of earth and wax, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to lean in, listening. As the service ended, they filed out into the night, the church door creaking shut behind them like a coffin lid. Thomas lingered last, kicking at a loose stone on the path, his breath fogging in the air. "Eliza," he whispered, catching her arm as the others moved ahead. "This pit, it's not right. Folks are talking of the Reverend's eyes, how they don't blink no more during prayer. We gotta stop this." She pulled away gently, the moonlight etching worry lines on her face. "He's my father, Thomas. And if it's faith, what choice do we have?" In the parsonage, Mayfield knelt by his bed, the vial empty now, its contents smeared across a crude map of the meadow. The pit would be deep, 20 feet, he reckoned, with walls shored by timber from the old barn. Enough for the faithful, with room for the provisions he'd hidden, Bibles, lanterns, jars of water drawn from the spring. The vision replayed in his mind, the earth closing over them, a protective womb, while the world above burned in judgment. A shiver ran through him, not of fear, but exaltation. God had chosen him for this, the preacher who would shepherd his flock into the soil's embrace. Eliza slipped into the room quietly, watching him from the doorway. He looked up, his face softening for the first time that night. "Daughter, the hour draws near. Will you stand with me?" She nodded, stepping closer, though her hand trembled at her side. The storm broke then, rain lashing the windows like impatient fists, and in the roar, she wondered if the voice she heard was thunder or something deeper, calling from the ground below. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the church's cracked walls, casting jagged shadows that clawed at Reverend Mayfield's face. He knelt before the altar, his fingers tracing the worn leather of his Bible, the pages yellowed like old bones. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying whispers of the fever that had claimed half the town already, whispers that sounded too much like accusations. But Elias heard only the Lord's command, clear as the tolling bell he had silenced days ago. Deacon Harlan stirred in the pew behind him, his breath ragged from the chill or perhaps the sickness gnawing at his lungs. "Reverend," he rasped, "the families, they're questioning. Widow Jenkins pulled her boy from the service this morning. Says it's madness, not mercy." Elias rose slowly, his black coat hanging loose on his frame, as if the weight of revelation had hollowed him out. He turned, eyes gleaming in the dim light, fixed on Harlan's weathered face. The deacon had been his right hand for 20 years, steady as the oak out front, but doubt had rooted in him like weeds. "Questioning is the devil's tongue, Harlan. The Lord spoke to me in the night, he demands purity. The earth will cradle them, safe from the plague's touch, until the resurrection." Harlan coughed into his sleeve, the sound wet and echoing. He didn't meet Elias's gaze, staring instead at the dirt-streaked floorboards. "And if they wake before judgment? Buried in those shallow pits by the river, it's not Christian. It's obedient." Elias's voice cut sharp, brooking no fracture. He stepped closer, the floor creaking under his boots, and placed a hand on Harlan's shoulder, firm, unyielding. The deacon flinched but held still, his loyalty a fraying rope. In the silence, the distant cry of a crow pierced the night, a black silhouette flapping past the window like a harbinger. By dawn, the congregation gathered in the yard, their faces gaunt under hooded cloaks, the air thick with the scent of damp soil and fear sweat. Elias stood on the steps, Bible raised like a banner, his words weaving through the mist. "Brethren, the Lord has shown me the path. The fever is his scourge, but in the earth's embrace, we find salvation. Who among you will step forward first?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, 30 souls, dwindling from the 100 who once filled the pews. Young Abigail Thorne, her dark hair pinned back severely, pushed to the front, her chin lifted in defiance born of desperation. Her father had succumbed 2 nights prior, his body carted to the pyre outside town, and the emptiness in her eyes burned fierce. "Reverend, my sister still breathes in that sickbed. If this ritual spares her, I'll go. But swear it on your soul." Elias nodded, a faint smile touching his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "On his soul, child. The pits are blessed, the soil will hold you as a mother holds her babe." He gestured to the men with shovels, Harlan among them, shoulders slumped, who had toiled through the night by the riverbank, carving out the long trench under moonlight. The earth there was soft, loamy, yielding like flesh. As the first volunteers shuffled forward, old Mr. Greer, clutching his rosary, and the miller's widow with her trembling hands, Abigail hesitated at the edge of the group. She glanced back at the church, where lanterns still burned inside, illuminating faces pressed to the glass, those too fearful or skeptical to join. Harlan shoveled dirt aside, his movements mechanical, each scoop revealing worms twisting in the cold soil. A low sob escaped the widow, and Elias began the prayer, his voice rising steady, drowning the wind. But as they lowered Greer into the pit, something shifted. The ground, freshly turned, gave way unevenly, a section collapsing inward with a wet suck, pulling at the ropes binding the man's ankles. Harlan lunged, grabbing the line, his boots slipping in the mud. "Hold! The bank's unstable, Reverend, we can't." Elias's prayer faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing at the fissure snaking through the earth. The crowd stilled, breaths held, as if the land itself recoiled. Abigail stepped closer, her hand on the widow's arm. "See? It's a sign. We stop this now." "No." Elias's tone brooked no dissent, though sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill. He waved Harlan on, forcing the descent. Greer vanished into the dark, the soil pattering over him like rain, his muffled gasp the last sound before silence. The others followed, one by one, their faith or fear propelling them down. But the fissure widened with each body, a yawning mouth that mocked the ritual's sanctity. By midday, half the trench was filled, the air heavy with the scent of turned earth and unspoken regret. Harlan wiped his brow, leaning on his shovel, and caught Abigail's eye across the pit. She mouthed a single word, escape, but he shook his head, trapped between devotion and dread. Elias paced the bank, Bible open, murmuring verses to seal the ground, yet the wind carried faint echoes from below, scratches, perhaps, or the imagination's cruel jest. As the sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows over the mound, a rumble stirred beneath, not thunder, but the earth settling uneasily, as if the buried stirred in their sleep. Elias froze, hand outstretched, and for a heartbeat, doubt flickered in his unblinking stare. Harlan dropped his shovel, the clang echoing like a warning bell, and the remaining faithful exchanged glances, the ritual's fragile hold beginning to crack. The lantern's flame guttered in the damp earth air, casting jagged shadows across the faces huddled in the pit. Reverend Mayfield knelt at the edge, his silhouette black against the torchlight above, reciting from a tattered Bible that seemed to swallow the words whole. "And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thy rod, and the waters shall divide, but here, my children, we embrace the closing of the sea upon us." His voice echoed strangely, muffled by the walls of loose soil that pressed in like a congregation of the damned. Elias Thorne, the blacksmith with hands calloused from hammer and anvil, shifted against the rough-hewn side of the grave. His breath came in shallow bursts, the weight of the dirt already caking his boots. Beside him, Widow Harlan clutched her shawl, her eyes wide but unblinking, as if the preacher's fervor had rooted her in place. "Reverend," Elias muttered, his voice a low rumble like forge bellows, "this ain't division. This is burial. We've dug our own tomb." He glanced up at the rope ladder dangling just out of reach, its frayed ends swaying in the draft from the surface. Mayfield paused, his eyes gleaming in the half-light, not with madness, but with a certainty that chilled deeper than the soil. He leaned forward, the Bible dangling from one hand like a judge's gavel. "Doubt is the serpent in your heart, Elias. The plague took the weak, fever and rot claimed half our town. But God has chosen us for the trial of earth, to be reborn through the soil's embrace. Feel it? The ground hungers for the pure." His fingers trailed along the edge, dislodging a cascade of pebbles that pattered down like hesitant rain. Widow Harlan whimpered, but she didn't move, her faith, or fear, held her fast. Elias's muscles tensed, the familiar ache of resistance building in his arms. He'd always been the steady one, mending plows and patching roofs while Mayfield spun his sermons into gold. But tonight, as the first shovelfuls began to fall from above, slow at first, like a courtesy, the blacksmith's caution cracked. He surged upward, grabbing the ladder's lowest rung, his boots scraping for purchase in the crumbling wall. "Come on, Martha," he growled to the widow, using her Christian name for the first time in years. "We ain't waiting for resurrection." The soil avalanched in response, a wet slide that buried Elias's calf to the knee. He yanked free, but the ladder twisted under his weight, fibers snapping like brittle bones. Mayfield's face appeared overhead, serene as a saint's portrait, flanked by the two deacons who drunk deepest from his well of words. Cling not to the flesh, brother. The earth will purify what the plague could not. Another load tumbled down, this one heavier, thudding against Elias's shoulder and sending him sprawling into the widow's lap. She pushed him away gently, her hands trembling but her voice steady. He speaks truth, Elias. The visions, the voices in the night. God called us here. Her eyes, once sharp with the grief of losing her husband to the fields, now held a glazed devotion that made Elias's stomach twist. The pit deepened with each scoop from above, the air growing thick with the scent of turned loam and something sharper, decay, perhaps, from the unmarked graves nearby. Elias clawed at the wall, fingers digging into the soft underlayer where roots snaked like veins. A sliver of moonlight pierced the narrowing gap above, illuminating the preacher's boots as he paced. The deacons shoveled in rhythm now, a dirge of earth, their faces masks of pious labor. Elias's mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the sudden sermons on Job's trials, the communal digging under the cover of harvest moon, the way Mayfield had isolated the faithful from the fleeing townsfolk. This wasn't salvation, it was a grave for the gullible. Martha, listen, Elias whispered, pulling her close as the dirt lapped at their waists. The plague's gone. Doctors from the city said so. This is his doing, Mayfield's fever dream. But her head shook, slow and final, as if the soil itself whispered back. Above, the preacher's voice rose in prayer, intoning the burial rite backward, from resurrection to descent. The latter vanished under a final cascade, and the pit's mouth began to seal, the world above shrinking to a slit of night sky. Elias's heart pounded like a hammer on anvil, forging resolve from panic. He pressed his back to the wall, feeling for leverage, his calluses scraping against stone hidden beneath the dirt. One push, one desperate lunge, perhaps enough to break through before the weight crushed them. But as the earth settled, heavy and unyielding, a low rumble echoed from below, not thunder, but something older, stirring in the depths. The widow gasped, her hand finding his in the dark, not for salvation, but for the shared terror of what the ground might yield. The lantern's flame guttered low in the damp tunnel, casting shadows that clawed at the rough-hewn walls like desperate fingers. Reverend Elias Mayfield pressed on, his boots sinking into the mud with each deliberate step, the weight of the shovel across his shoulder a constant reminder of the grave he'd left unfinished above. Behind him, the faint echoes of the congregation's muffled cries had faded into an oppressive silence, broken only by the drip of water from unseen crevices. He whispered a prayer under his breath, not for their souls, but for the clarity that had guided him to this act of divine severance. Sister Abigail trailed at a distance, her skirts heavy with filth, the lantern swinging in her trembling hand. She'd followed him down the hidden shaft beneath the churchyard without question at first, her faith in the Reverend as unyielding as the iron cross she clutched. But now, as the air grew thicker with the scent of earth and decay, doubt gnawed at her resolve. "Reverend," she called softly, her voice cracking like dry leaves, "the Lord tests us, but this feels like wandering into the belly of the beast." Mayfield paused at a fork in the passage, the walls narrowing to a point where his broad shoulders nearly brushed stone on both sides. He turned his face illuminated in flickers of orange light, eyes burning with the fervor that had drawn the flock to him in the first place. "The beast is the world above, sister. Corrupted by sin, by the whispers of the serpent that coil through every heart. God spoke to me in the night, clear as thunder. The burial was mercy, a planting of seeds in holy soil. They stir not in torment, but in rebirth." She stepped closer, the lantern light revealing the pallor of her cheeks, streaked with grime. In her mind, flashes of the service replayed, the Reverend's voice rising like a storm, urging the faithful to lie in the prepared pit as an act of ultimate surrender. One by one, they'd complied, Widow Hargrove with her rosary, young Thomas with his wide-eyed trust, until the dirt began to fall. Abigail had hesitated then, her hand frozen on the shovel, but Mayfield's gaze had pinned her, promising salvation in the madness. A low rumble echoed from the left tunnel, like the groan of settling earth, and Mayfield's lips curled in what might have been a smile. "Hear that? The ground weeps for the unburied." We must press on to the chamber below. There, in the heart of the hill, the true testament awaits. He chose the left path without waiting, his stride purposeful, as if pulled by an invisible thread. Abigail followed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The tunnel sloped downward, the air cooling to a chill that seeped into her bones. She thought of her husband, buried proper 5 years past, his stone marker clean and above ground. What madness had gripped the Reverend to drag them all into this subterranean vigil? Yet the stories he'd told in sermons, of ancient prophets sealed in caves, emerging renewed, stirred something in her, a flicker of hope amid the dread. They emerged into a wider cavern, the lantern's beam catching on veins of quartz that glittered like frozen tears. At the center stood a crude altar of stacked stones, atop which lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and faded. Mayfield knelt before it reverently, setting the shovel aside. "This is the relic," he murmured, tracing the embossed symbol, a circle pierced by thorns. "Brought from the old world, passed to me by the hand of Providence. It reveals the will unspoken in Scripture." Abigail approached warily, her free hand brushing the wall for support. The book fell open at his touch, pages yellowed and brittle, filled with script in a tongue she couldn't place, Latin, perhaps, or something older. Mayfield read aloud, his voice a rhythmic chant that filled the space, words twisting like smoke. As he spoke, the rumble returned, stronger now, vibrating through the floor. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and Abigail coughed, shielding her eyes. "Sister, witness," Mayfield said, rising with the book in hand. "The burial awakens the guardians. They will rise to protect the pure, to bury the impure deeper still." His eyes locked on hers, intense, unblinking. For a moment, she saw not the shepherd of her soul, but a man hollowed by visions, his faith a shroud over something feral. The ground shuddered again, and from the shadows beyond the altar, a shape stirred, not human, but elongated, like roots uncoiling in the dark. Abigail's heart hammered, the lantern slipping from her grasp to shatter against the stone. In the sudden gloom, Mayfield's laughter echoed, low and triumphant, as the chamber plunged into blackness pierced only by the faint glow of his eyes. The lantern's flame guttered in the damp air of the pit, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the earthen walls like desperate fingers. Reverend Elias Mayfield knelt in the muck, his once pristine black coat caked with soil, the fabric heavy against his shoulders. He had descended alone into this makeshift grave, the first to test the depth, whispering prayers that echoed hollowly off the roots twisting through the clay. Above, the congregation waited in the twilight, their faces pale smudges against the fading sky, Brother Harlan with his perpetual scowl, Sister Lydia clutching her shawl as if it could ward off the chill, and young Tobias, the boy whose wide eyes held more questions than faith. "Reverend, it's too deep," Harlan called down, his voice rough as gravel, laced with the doubt he never quite voiced in sermons. The rope ladder swayed precariously, frayed from the hurried digging. "We can't all fit without smothering." Mayfield paused, his hands pressing into the cold earth, feeling the pulse of the ground beneath him. It was God's design, he knew, this burial not of death, but rebirth. The visions had come clear in the night, fire and flood washing away the sins of the valley, leaving only the pure. But the pit resisted, wider than planned, the walls slick and unstable after the afternoon rain. He rose slowly, the mud sucking at his boots, and gripped the ladder. "Depth is mercy," he replied, his tone steady, though his breath caught on the lie. "The Lord buried Noah's world in water, will trust the soil to renew us." As he climbed, the ladder creaked, a single rung splintering under his weight. He froze, heart pounding against his ribs, the drop below a black maw that seemed to whisper temptations of escape. Lydia's gasp carried down, soft and fearful, but it was Tobias who scrambled forward, grabbing the rope's end to steady it. The boy was brave in his silence, his small hands calloused from farm work, pulling with a determination that belied his 12 years. Mayfield reached the lip, hauling himself over, and for a moment, their eyes met, gray against the boy's earnest brown, and something unspoken passed, a flicker of the madness they all shared in this forsaken hollow. Night fell swiftly, the stars hidden behind thickening clouds that promised more rain. The group worked by lantern light, lowering bundles of cloth-wrapped belongings into the pit, Bibles, a few meager provisions, the silver cross from the chapel steeple that glinted like a promise. Harlan argued again, his voice rising as he hefted a shovel. "This ain't salvation, Elias. It's a tomb. What if the visions are just fevered dreams from that bad well water?" He jabbed the blade into the soil, but his swings lacked conviction, the earth yielding grudgingly. Mayfield turned, his face illuminated harshly, shadows carving deep lines into his brow. "Doubt is the devil's seed, brother. We've seen the signs, the river rising, the crows circling the steeple. God calls us to bury the old life, to rise clean." He spoke with the fervor that had drawn them here, from scattered farms to this remote glen, but inside, the weight pressed heavier. The previous night, alone in the parsonage, he dreamed of suffocation, of voices clawing from below, accusing. Yet the compulsion burned brighter, a holy fire he couldn't quench. Lydia approached then, her steps hesitant, the hem of her dress dragging through puddles. She was the cautious one, always mending what broke, her hand steady with needle and thread. "Reverend, the boy's scared," she murmured, nodding toward Tobias, who shoveled dirt with mechanical rhythm, his face streaked with grime. "He asks if we'll breathe down there, if the Lord will send air like manna." Mayfield placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremble she tried to hide. "Tell him faith is the breath we need. We'll lie close, heads to the surface, and pray through the night. Dawn will unseal us, renewed." But as he spoke, a low rumble echoed from the woods, a distant thunder, or perhaps the earth itself protesting. The pit's edge crumbled slightly under Harlan's foot, sending a cascade of pebbles into the dark. They began the descent in pairs, the latter straining under their weight. Harlan and Lydia first, their forms vanishing into the gloom, followed by muffled assurances that echoed up like ghosts. Tobias hesitated at the edge, his shovel abandoned, knuckles white on the rope. Mayfield knelt beside him, the mud cold against his knees. "The Lord buried Lazarus for 4 days, he said softly, and called him forth. This is our Lazarus moment, son." The boy nodded, but his eyes darted to the surrounding trees, where branches swayed like accusing arms. Together they climbed down, the air growing thicker, laced with the scent of wet clay and decay. At the bottom, the others huddled in the shallow depression, backs to the wall, the bundled cross propped like a sentinel. The space was tighter than anticipated, their breaths mingling in the confined dark, each inhale pulling from the shared volume. Harlan shifted, his elbow brushing Mayfield's side. "If this goes wrong, Elias, it's on you." Mayfield didn't reply, instead beginning the chant, a low hymn of burial and resurrection, his voice weaving through the tension. The rope was pulled up last, coiled away by no one, leaving them in isolation. Above, the wind howled, and rain began to patter, seeping into the soil like tears. In the pit, the walls seemed to close in, the first real dread settling as water trickled down, pooling at their feet. Tobias pressed close to Lydia, his whisper barely audible, "What if he forgets us?" But Mayfield prayed on, his words a fragile barrier against the rising damp, the earth alive around them, waiting to claim or release. The lantern's flame guttered low in the cramped tunnel, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the damp earth walls. Reverend Mayfield knelt at the head of the line, his black coat smeared with mud, hands clasped around the iron-shod Bible as if it were the only anchor in the suffocating dark. Behind him, Eliza's breath came in shallow rasps, her fingers twisting the hem of her shawl until the threads frayed. Tom, the youngest of them, pressed against the rear, his wiry frame coiled like a spring, eyes darting to the faint sliver of moonlight above where the congregation's pit yawned open. "Steady now," Mayfield murmured, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the roots snaking through the soil. "The Lord tests us in the belly of the earth, as he did Jonah. This grave is our baptism, sisters and brothers. Hold to faith, and we'll rise renewed." His words hung heavy, laced with that unyielding certainty that had drawn them all here, to this forsaken hollow in the Kentucky woods. But Eliza felt the weight of it differently, the press of dirt already sifting down from the edges, like the first grains of judgment. She shifted on her knees, the rough hemp rope binding their wrists chafing her skin. It was meant to symbolize unity, Mayfield had said, linking them in prayer as the earth claimed them. Yet her mind raced with the faces left above, the deacons shoveling with fervent zeal, their chants rising like a dirge. "Reverend," she whispered, leaning forward until her lips brushed his ear. "The air's thinning already. If we don't call it off, hush, woman." His rebuke was soft but ironclad, eyes gleaming in the lantern light. "Doubt is the devil's whisper. Remember Widow Hargrove? She faltered last spring, and the blight took her fields. This is purification. God's will, clear as scripture." He turned slightly, his profile sharp against the glow, beard streaked with soil like prophetic markings. Eliza swallowed the retort, glancing back at Tom, whose face was pale but set, jaw clenched in that boyish defiance. Tom tugged at the rope binding him to Eliza, the fibers biting into his palms. He'd volunteered for this inner circle, the faithful vanguard, thinking it a test of mettle, a story to tell grandchildren. But now, with the tunnel's mouth shrinking as clods of earth tumbled in, regret soured his throat. "Preacher," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "That crossbeam up top, it's groaning. One good rain, and the whole pit collapses for real. We praying our way out of a landslide?" Mayfield's laugh was a dry bark, devoid of mirth. "The Lord parts seas and moves mountains, Thomas. This is no landslide, it's revelation." He raised the Bible, its pages fluttering like trapped wings. "Recite with me, though I walk through the valley of the shadow," but Tom's eyes fixed on a shadow that wasn't born of the lantern, a faint scuttling along the wall, pale fingers of root or something worse, burrowing closer. The air thickened with the scent of wet loam and something metallic, like blood long buried. Eliza noticed it too, her free hand pressing against the earth as if to push back the inevitable. The rope between them grew taut as she leaned away, instinct overriding the bonds. Above, the chant swelled, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soil like a heartbeat. Mayfield pressed on, his voice rising in fervor, but Tom felt the first real crack, not in the beam, but in the plan they'd whispered about in the pre-dawn hours. Escape through the old fox den branching off this tunnel, a desperate fork Eliza had mapped from childhood tales. It was their one shot, if the preacher's trance held. Psalms 23, Mayfield intoned, oblivious or willfully blind. The lantern sputtered again, shadows leaping like accusations. Eliza's whisper cut through, "Now, Tom. Pull." He yanked, the rope snapping with a wet tear, frayed by her earlier twisting. She lunged forward, grabbing Mayfield's shoulder, but he twisted free, eyes widening in betrayal. "What heresy is this?" The Bible thumped to the ground, pages splaying in the mud. The scuttling grew louder, a chitinous rustle from the walls, as if the earth itself stirred in hunger. Tom hauled Eliza toward the fork, the tunnel narrowing to a crawl, their breaths mingling in panic. Mayfield's shout echoed behind, "Traitors! The grave claims the unworthy first." But his voice cracked, the first fracture in his divine armor. They squeezed into the side passage, roots snagging at their clothes like grasping hands. The air turned colder, fouler, carrying the faint echo of muffled screams from the main pit, perhaps imagination, perhaps the first true cost. Eliza's hand found Tom's in the dark, slick with sweat and soil. "Keep moving," she gasped. "Before he brings them all down on us." Behind, the tunnel filled with the preacher's frantic scrambling, his lantern bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp. The earth groaned, a low rumble that promised collapse, and in that moment, faith felt as fragile as the rope they'd severed. The fox den twisted ahead, a black maw leading who knew where, salvation or deeper burial. Tom's heart pounded, the dread coiling tighter, as the shadows swallowed Mayfield's cries. The lantern's flame guttered low in the suffocating dark, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the wooden walls of the pit. Elias Thorne, his breaths ragged and shallow, pressed his ear to the earth-packed barrier above, listening for any sound beyond the frantic heartbeats of those still alive down here. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sour reek of fierce sweat, mingled with the faint, decaying sweetness from the bodies that had gone still hours ago. He could feel the weight of the soil above them, a relentless pressure that squeezed his ribs like an iron vice, reminding him that Reverend Mayfield's sermon had not been metaphor but madness made manifest. "Quiet," whispered Sarah, her voice a threadbare rasp from the corner where she huddled. Her fingers, smeared with mud and worse, clutched the frayed edge of her shawl, the one her mother had woven before the fever took her. Brave in the face of the parson's zealotry, she'd been the first to challenge him up there on the hillside, her words sharp as a switch: "This ain't salvation, Reverend, it's slaughter." Now, her eyes gleamed with a feverish determination, the only light in her gaunt face. Beside her, old Josiah muttered prayers that dissolved into coughs, his once steady hands trembling as he pawed at the loose dirt they'd clawed away in futile bursts. Elias shifted, his knees sinking into the muck, and drove the makeshift shovel, a splintered plank from Widow Hargrove's coffin, deeper into the wall. Splinters bit into his palms, but he ignored the sting. The plan had been simple when the first screams echoed from the edge of the grave: dig sideways, toward the creek bed where the earth might give way. But the soil fought back, collapsing in wet clumps that sealed their progress as fast as they made it. "We ain't far," he lied, his voice steady for her sake. Cautious by nature, Elias had always been the one to mend fences and soothe tempers in the congregation, never one for bold strokes. Yet here, buried like sinners in a pauper's plot, caution felt like surrender. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, distant at first, like thunder rolling over the Missouri hills. Sarah's head snapped up, her breath catching. "What in God's name?" Josiah crossed himself, his lips moving in silent invocation, but Elias froze, the plank slipping from his grip. The sound grew, a grinding roar that shook pebbles from the ceiling, dusting their hair like ash from a dying fire. Up above, the Reverend's voice pierced the din, amplified by the night wind: "Hear the Lord's judgment. The unworthy shall remain in the bosom of the earth, as it is written." The pit shuddered violently. Elias lunged for Sarah, pulling her down as a cascade of dirt avalanched from the weakened ceiling. Josiah cried out, his arm vanishing under a slide of soil that pinned him half-buried. The lantern tipped, oil spilling in a dark pool that ignited with a whoosh, flames licking up the walls in hungry fingers. Heat seared Elias's face as he beat at the fire with his coat, the fabric smoking and charring. Sarah scrambled to Josiah, digging with her bare hands, nails tearing on roots and stones. "Hold on, old man, don't you dare leave us now." Through the haze of smoke and falling earth, Elias glimpsed a sliver of moonlight cracking through the barrier, a fissure widening with each tremor. The creek, he realized, its spring flood must be undermining the grave's edge. Hope flickered, fragile as the dying light, but so did dread: if the walls gave way too soon, the whole pit would swallow them whole. He grabbed the plank again, hacking at the gap, his muscles burning with the effort. "Push through, now." Sarah nodded, her wit flashing in the chaos: "If heaven's waitin', it can hold for one more swing." The roar peaked, earth groaning like a beast awakened. Josiah's hand broke free, grasping Elias's ankle with desperate strength. As the fissure yawned wider, admitting a rush of cool, root-scented air, shadows loomed above, figures silhouetted against the stars. Not saviors, but the Reverend and his faithful few, their faces twisted in pious fervor, shovels raised to reinforce the breach. Mayfield's eyes, wild and unblinking, met Elias's through the gap. "The trial refines the soul," he intoned, his voice a serpent's hiss. "Flee if you must, but no gods will bind tighter than any chain." Elias's heart hammered as he wedged the plank into the crack, leveraging with all his weight. Sarah hauled Josiah clear, the old man's gasps mingling with the crackle of dying flames. The ground buckled beneath them, a chasm threatening to pull them under, but they surged forward, clawing toward the surface. The cost pressed in, the lives lost below, the madness that had driven a shepherd to bury his flock. Freedom dangled just beyond reach, but so did the Reverend's unyielding grasp, a shadow that promised no easy escape. The lantern's flame flickered low in the sodden earth, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the wooden braces of the pit. Reverend Mayfield knelt at the edge, his black coat caked with mud, hands clasped as if in prayer. But his eyes, those fever-bright eyes, darted toward the faint scratches echoing from below. Elias, the deacon who'd followed him this far out of blind faith, stood rigid beside him, his pitchfork trembling in his grip. The air hung thick with the scent of turned soil and something sharper, like fear distilled into rot. "They're singing again, Reverend," Elias whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. He leaned over the lip, peering into the gloom where the last of the congregation huddled. 30 souls, packed into the makeshift grave like cordwood, their hymns muffled now by the weight of the night. Mayfield had promised ascension, a burial into the bosom of the Lord, but the songs had twisted into pleas hours ago. Mayfield rose slowly, his joints protesting the damp chill. "It's the devil's mimicry, Elias. God tests the faithful with echoes of despair." He placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder, firm, unyielding. Elias flinched but didn't pull away. In the torchlight, Mayfield's face seemed carved from the same unyielding stone as the hillside church, lines etched deep by visions only he could see. A sharper sound cut through, a child's wail, piercing and raw. Elias's face paled, and he gripped the pitchfork tighter, knuckles whitening. "That ain't no hymn, sir. That's little Mary's voice. We can't leave him down there much longer." His words tumbled out, laced with the doubt that had been festering since the first shovelful of dirt fell. Mayfield's gaze hardened, turning toward the distant tree-line where the storm clouds gathered like an accusation. "Doubt is the serpent in your heart, boy. I saw the angel in the flames last Sabbath, clear as the scars on my palms. It commanded this rite. To bury the old flesh, that the spirit might rise untainted." He extended his hands, palms up, revealing the crude burns from his self-inflicted trials. The skin glistened, raw and accusing. Elias swallowed hard, eyes flicking back to the pit. The scratches grew frantic, nails splintering against the rough-hewn walls. He remembered the sermons, the way Mayfield's voice had swelled like thunder, drawing the whole town into this madness. But now, with the wind howling and the ground soft underfoot, it felt like a grave for them all. "What if you're wrong?" The question slipped out, soft as a confession. The Reverend's laugh was low, mirthless, swallowed by the gusts. He seized Elias's arm, pulling him close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath, hidden sin, even for a prophet. "Wrong? I've buried my own doubts deeper than this. The Lord spoke, the plague comes for the unworthy, but these are the elect. They'll breathe the breath of heaven soon enough." Thunder rumbled, distant but closing. Elias jerked free, stepping back toward the pile of loose earth they'd mounded earlier. His mind raced, images of his wife down there, her hand clutching his sleeve that morning as they marched to the field. She'd believed, or tried to. Now her voice joined the chorus, faint and fading. Mayfield watched him, unblinking, as if weighing the deacon's soul on invisible scales. "If you falter, Elias, you'll join them in the dirt. Not as saved, but as chaff." The words landed like stones, heavy with the weight of their shared isolation. No one else remained. The town had emptied into this pit, lured by promises of purity amid the cholera whispers from the east. Elias's resolve cracked. He dropped the pitchfork, the iron clanging against a root. "I can't," he muttered, turning toward the path back to the church. But Mayfield was faster, lunging forward with surprising strength, tackling him to the mud-slick ground. They rolled, grunting, the Reverend's fingers digging into Elias's throat like roots seeking purchase. "You think to betray the vision?" Mayfield snarled, his weight pinning the younger man. Rain began to fall in earnest, fat drops stinging their faces. Below, the cries sharpened into a cacophony, a desperate symphony of the damned. Elias bucked, gasping, his hand closing around a jagged rock half buried in the earth. He swung it wild, connecting with Mayfield's temple. The Reverend slumped, blood blooming dark against the mud. Elias scrambled up, chest heaving, staring at the crumpled form. The pit's edge loomed beside him, the scratches now frantic, begging. He hesitated, the rock slipping from numb fingers. The storm broke fully, sheets of rain turning the ground to slurry. Elias glanced at Mayfield, then down into the abyss. A hand, pale, mud-streaked, breached the edge, fingers clawing for air. It was his wife's. With a sob, he dropped to his knees, reaching. But the earth gave way beneath him, the loose soil crumbling like faith under trial. He slid, grasping at roots, the pit swallowing him inch by inch. Mayfield stirred behind him, a low groan rising with the wind. As Elias tumbled into the darkness, arms wrapping around him in a frantic embrace, the Reverend's voice echoed above, faint, but certain. God's will, ascending. The lid of soil slammed shut, one final, smothering note in the night's dirge. The wind howled through the cracks in the earth like a dirge from the depths, carrying the faint, muffled echoes that Reverend Elias Mayfield had long since learned to ignore. He stood at the edge of the great pit, his boots sinking into the soft loam of the hillside, the shovel still gripped in his calloused hands. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, as if heaven itself recoiled from the scene below. 23 souls, or what had been souls, lay interred there, their forms wrapped in simple burlap, packed tight in the soil like seeds awaiting a harvest that would never come. Elias's breath came steady, untroubled, as he wiped sweat from his brow with a sleeve stained dark from the day's labor. He had preached it to them one last time, in the dim lantern light of the chapel, his voice rising like thunder over their murmurs of doubt. The Lord calls us to the bosom of the earth, he had said, his eyes burning with the fire of revelation. Not to scatter like chaff in the wind, but to root deep, where the wicked cannot touch us. This plague, this blight upon our fields and our bodies, it is the devil's scourge, come to test the faithful. But in burial, we find rebirth. God's will, brothers and sisters. God's unyielding will. Some had nodded, their faces gaunt from the fever that had already claimed half the town. Others had wept, clutching children close, but none had fled. Not from Elias. He was their anchor, the man who had pulled them from the brink of starvation 2 winters past, who had wrestled demons in the night and emerged whole. Now, as twilight deepened, the echoes from below grew insistent, a scrape here, a gasp there, like roots straining against stone. Elias knelt, pressing his ear to the cool dirt. He could almost hear their voices, fragmented pleas rising through the layers. Reverend, why, the air, it's gone, but he knew better. These were not cries of the living, but temptations from the pit, the adversary's last ploy to unmoor him. He had felt it before, in the quiet hours after his wife's passing, when the shadows in their cabin whispered of regret. No. This was sanctity. This was salvation. A rustle in the underbrush pulled him upright. His daughter, Abigail, emerged from the tree lean, her skirts muddied, a lantern swinging in her hand. At 16, she carried the weight of the world in her sharp green eyes, the same eyes that had watched him dig the first grave months ago, when the sickness began. She had been the cautious one, always, questioning his visions with that quiet steel in her voice. Father, she said now, her words clipped against the wind, it's done. The last markers are set. But, the ground. It's shifting. Elias rose, dusting his hands, and took the lantern from her. The light flickered over the pit's edge, illuminating fresh fissures in the soil, thin veins cracking outward like lightning frozen in place. He nodded, unperturbed. The earth settles, child. It embraces them. But Abigail's gaze lingered on those cracks, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. She had helped, yes, hauling the ropes, steadying the planks as they lowered the bundles one by one, but her help had come with questions, whispered in the night. Is this truly God's voice, or yours alone? They stood in silence as the first stars pricked the sky, the air growing thick with the scent of turned soil and something sharper, metallic. Then it came, a low rumble, deep as a heartbeat, vibrating up through their souls. The ground trembled, not violently, but with a patient insistence, as if the hill itself were exhaling. Dirt cascaded into the pit, pattering like rain, and from the depths rose a chorus, indistinct at first, then clearer, a cacophony of coughs and sobs, hands clawing at the unyielding weight above. Abigail stepped back, her face paling in the lantern's glow. "They're alive, Father. We buried them too soon. The fever broke, they're fighting it off." Her voice cracked, not with hysteria, but with the raw edge of betrayal. She had seen it in the chapel, the way some had stirred as the laudanum wore thin, their eyes fluttering open to the reality of their fate. Elias had pressed on, intoning psalms over the ropes, but now doubt flickered in her stance, a cautious retreat from the man she had once followed without question. He turned to her, his expression serene, almost paternal. "No, Abigail. This is the trial. The devil stirs the soil to mock our faith. Listen closer, they plead for release into temptation, but God has sealed them for judgment." He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm, guiding. But she shrugged it off, her eyes darting to the widening cracks. A hand broke through then, pale and desperate, fingers splayed against the night air, grasping at nothing. It belonged to Widow Hargrove, he knew, the one who had baked bread for the orphans until her own strength failed. The rumble swelled, the earth groaning as more hands emerged, a grotesque bloom of limbs and faces smeared with mud. Screams pierced the air, raw and human, carrying names, Elias's name, called in accusation. Abigail stumbled toward the pit, her lantern dropping, spilling light across the chaos. "We have to help them," she cried, already reaching for the shovel. But Elias moved faster, his wits sharpened by years of sermons forged in solitude. He seized her arm, pulling her back with a strength born of conviction. "This is not mercy, daughter. This is perdition. They chose this path with me, burial as baptism. To unearth them now is to defy the Lord." His voice held steady, earnest, as if explaining a parable to the young. Yet beneath it, a tremor, not fear, but the quiet thrill of righteousness tested. She wrenched free, tears carving tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. For a moment, they stood divided.